Welcome to Stories from the Hearth, the podcast for tall tales and fantastical fiction, short stories the likes of which you might once have heard a wandering bard tell to a group of villagers gathered around the fire. Each episode will feature a brand new story written and performed by me, Callum Bannerman. Historical, romantic, science fiction or fantasy, these are tales to transport you, doorways into another world. Today's story contains explicit language and explores themes of both a sexual and racial nature. Episode 1: The Imam and His Pirates. Coffee charged her bones like powder down the barrel of a 10-pound blunderbuss, her third of the morning. It was easy to see why the Imam of Oman had extended her crew the offer of a royal pardon, on the condition that he should receive for his birthday the delivery of 100 brimming barrels of these little green beans. 100 barrels. They'd taken a tenth of that in heads, just to bend the ear of the local chieftain. 10 more to get him to trade. Shahar herself had taken a round of buckshot on a sightseeing tour of the chieftain's cousin's son's digestive tract, and watched curiously as a black-brown gloop fell from him to colour the sand. She remembered thinking that their blood looked darker, richer even, than the sickly red she'd watched squirt from the lopped-off wrists of thieves in memories of a childhood marketplace. Their skin, too, was darker. Like roasted coffee beans, Ali Omar had said. They spent so much time harvesting and roasting the beans, the heat of the braziers had roasted their skin too, he said. A curious people. Today, Shahar hunched over her breakfast in the galley of his imame's proudly procured ship, the moonlit Voyager. Muhammad had ridden to heaven on the back of a man-faced donkey horse. The prow of Shahar's ship was carved with the head of a beautiful boy, innocent to their plunders, and when they sailed beneath the boundless skies of an early evening, she supposed it did feel as if they were bearing heavenward. Indeed, Shahar meant moonlit, an omen of good portent if she said so herself. Shame, however, that she could never reveal that to her crewmates. The crew of the moonlit Voyager knew Shahar as Yazid al-Mufakir, Yazid the Thinker. A light barb, but not unwarranted. Quiet, solitary, heavily bearded, Yazid was known to the crew in snippets of rumour and vivid splashes of deed. Intimately violent when necessary, he spoke with a voice high and lilting as summer wine. The first, and last, of the Moonlit's pirates to mimic Yazid's effeminate tone had exited the ship keel side. A most devout follower of Allah, Shahar, as Yazid, kept mostly to themselves, often lost to contemplation and religious ablutions, for which they insisted on using fresh water rather than the salty stuff, and to which they were left alone. On this particular morning, 10 days out from the port city of Berbera, 10 days clean of its stench, incense, cattle dung, sweaty men and dried fruit, Shahar found herself rather unusually surrounded by her crewmates. Under the fiery influence of the steaming black stuff, it had fast become routine for her to wake earlier than normal, sink a few cups, and set to work on deck before most of the crew had even begun untangling themselves from their hammocks. But this morning, the galley was abuzz. The din of chatter cut through her thoughts. Aye, she promised she'd wait. What? Don't believe me? Coming from a man who dips his sword less often than a stranded camel finds water? You're a fool, Omar. I've more sense than you empty-headed oaf. More sense than to hope a village daughter I once convinced to spread her legs hasn't been married off to some other fool already.
Probably had a marriage deal on the table when you ploughed her, come to think of it. At least have the decency to have a wife back home.
Aye, a wife I'm sure would love to know how much you've been drooling over the Ethiopian pink we've got in cargo.
Crude bastards, the pair of you. What is it? Combined age of 30 between you? Omar, we've all seen you eyeing them. May Allah shield his eyes. May he cover his ears, we've heard you thinking of them in your bunk.
If you want to go, you've got today, and that's it. But be gentle. When we dock in Muscat tomorrow, they're to be presented as offering to the Imam's son-in-law. Word is, he likes black cunt the best. You scratch the merchandise, you pay for it. And best believe there'll be no royal pardon this time. As for you, Nasri, stay away from the locals, please. It's a matter of time before one of your conquests sinks this old wretched barnacle. Trust me, the world of women will not mourn the loss of your warty Tadja. A high-pitched influenza of laughter travelled the galley. Even Shahar scoffed dryly, glad to see Nasri taken down a peg or two. The jokester, an older man with a scar the length of Shahar's cutlass running from forehead to breastbone, turned to her. He paused with a handful of mutabak an inch from his mouth. What say you, Yazid? Shahar, caught chewing through a fatoot of fried bread, stale, passable in the clarified butter, and egg, also stale, a deal less passable, did not look up from her plate. At length, she washed down the fatoot with the last swill of coffee from her cup. She took her time, not relishing the newly wrought quiet of the packed galley. She knew that a reply from her, from Yazid, was a novelty. She also knew that most of the crew were still drunk from the night before. Tej, Ethiopian honey wine not explicitly forbade by the Quran, and thus apparently sin-free. A drunken crew was a demanding crew, and they did not wish to hear her silence. I say, began Shahar, making it up as she went along, that far from mourning the loss, women of the world may now rejoice, knowing that they need never suck the dust from that calloused stump ever again. Absolute and deafening uproar. The old pirate who'd asked the question slammed his fist to the table, scattering mincemeat and pancake shrapnel to the four winds. Omar wept to see the look on his friend's face. Men the room over grabbed each other by the shoulders to keep from falling from their benches, bellies shuddering with uncontrollable laughter. Nasri trained his eyes on the man he knew as Yazid, two burning gemstones of purple, smouldering in the night.
He hasn't even,
tried Nasri, struggling to be heard above the taunts and mimicry.
How can you? Yazid doesn't even look at women. He's a fag. Yazid's a fag.
But to Shahar's eternal thanks, no one heeded the man's vitriol, and his attempts to divert attention were met only with reprimand. Some old deckhand, the kind of sailor for whom the moonlit voyager was one among an endless naval fleet roaming the oceans of his memory, grabbed Nasri in a headlock and scoured the scalp of the man with his knuckles. More laughter. Amidst the tumult, Shahar slipped quietly from the belly of the boat. Climbing the rolling stairs up and out of the dankness, she emerged on deck, squinting against the sheer light of day. At sea, you were the centre of the world. In no other setting was that possible. But afloat the big blue-green, with nothing but whitecaps and the occasional crowd of bobbing birds between you and the edges of the earth, you existed in the very middle of everything. Rounding the Cape of Oman the previous evening, the moonlight's omnipotence had cracked. From over the horizon had lurched first shallow beaches, followed close behind by the beige minaret and twisting towers of Al-Had Fortress, sand-coloured for a sand people. Gentle on the eyes, yet camouflaged from sight, if not for the baby blue of sky serving as a backdrop. This morning, Random scatterings of cloud beat a hasty retreat before the vanguard of the sun. And now the entire portside view was of coastline, hard and real and tangible, an anxious reminder to Shahar that soon they would dock and she would be out of time. At the stern stood the captain, Abd al-Yasu ibn Salman ibn Muhammad al-Suruyan, a long-winded name for a rather laconic man. The wind was strong, and in it Abd al-Yasu's kaftan caught like a sail. Sheer white, though Shahar knew from closer inspection of the delicate umber woven through, it sang a pirate song in the golden light of mid-morn. A song of buried treasure, clean sea air, and the brittle cold of open ocean. A handsome man, and the only sailor aboard who Shahar harboured any respect for. Stern and decisive, she'd watched him first-hand in his negotiations with the Ethiopian chief. A gravely bloody man, too, who had crushed the skull of the chief's personal guard, as an example of what would happen to all the people of that place, were his crew not gifted the treasure they'd come for. That being coffee, and a score of village women to take as slaves. An ugly job, but Shahar appreciated its necessity. All of their necks were on the line this time, and the Omani Imam had his hand aloft, ready and happy to conduct their executions with a flick of his mightily ordained and much bejewelled wrist. Below the captain, in the soft shadow of the mainsail, were chained the women. Shahar grimaced. She knew that for them there had been no possible escape from this fate. She knew so because she'd helped seal it, with cutlass and musket, blunderbuss and indifference. She could not help, however, but feel some contempt for the poor sods. Blind little girls, she thought, shackled like cattle bound for market. She wondered if at any point, from the day of their conception until now, until the whips, the chains, the torture, any of them had thought of running, of leaving town, jumping ship. She supposed at least most of them were probably now dreaming of the latter. But to stay in such a place, a village full of men who would exchange you for their lives at the first taste of fear, to Shahar, that was shameful. She held many feelings regarding the women, cowering in their huddled mass of hair and breasts and eyes, low and sad. A complicated well of emotion, doubtless some of which stemmed from Shahar's own failings as a woman, but which deep down was undeniably undercut by something akin to love. Kindred affiliation was perhaps closer to Shahar's own notion of the feeling, a gutting, angry vacuum in the pit of her stomach, a throbbing sense of duty, one which Shahar had spent 10 days contemplating. One more day, and she would be out of time, and no matter what she decided, whether her disguise and the life she'd built around her was or was not more important than the lives of these women, it would be too late to act.
Please, mister. Water. Please.
A voice like the sandstone canyons of home, old of experience, harsh as desert, wheezed along the deck, barely reaching the ears of Shahar before collapsing. It stirred the pirate women from distant thoughts of a distant place. Soon, more of the slaves took up their companion's call, their cries desperate, anxious, excited by a deck free of their tormentors, empty except for the one they called Simi Seti. Shahar grit her teeth. She caught sight of Captain Abd al-Yasu turning from his spyglass, the crease of his brow etched alarmingly.
"Shut them up, Yazid!"
he shouted, gesticulating his frustration in an awkward wave of the hand.
"Damn women! See, now I've lost my bloody focus."
The captain stormed from his post at the wheel to a bench built into the stern railings. Shahar knew that by the bench the Syrian kept a hookah pipe and a pouch of flavoured tobacco. An otherworldly indulgence, and one which, before embarkation on this particular vessel, she had held no prior knowledge of. A distinctly Persian practice, practiced by a Syrian Christian, captaining a crew of Arab Muslims pulled together from every corner of the Mohammedan world. How very odd, she thought.
Please, miss. Water. Please, miss.
Had she heard that right? Had that woman just called her? Eyes bulging, Shahar felt fear tug at the exposed skin of her ankles. Damp, clammy, slimy fear. The woman held her hands to her, cupped, as if she might, like the Prophet Yasu, conjure water to moisten their cracked and weedy lifelines. Their eyes were sallow, yellow almost, and their cheeks gaunt. The Imam of Oman had commanded them that they bring him a herd of beauties. This lot, after 10 days of malnourishment, abuse, and unforgiving sun, were more akin to a corpus of beasts. Shahar stepped among them, keeping her eyes trained on the one about to call her Miss again, concentrating hard on the rage that word induced, trying even harder to ignore the sorrow she felt. She ran the back of her hand with swift and unmitigated punishment across the woman's temple. The slave yelped and crumbled. Almost instantly, the punished woman was secreted away beneath a canopy of caring hands and sacrificed bodies. The woman moaned a low, collective moan, but all question of water stopped. From where she stood, Shahar could just see the captain's eyes, peering from the stern. He caught hers and nodded, then shut his and reclined, as if exhausted from playing his part in the silencing of the slaves. Shahar watched him for a while, until she was certain of his dozing. Then secretly, quietly, she filled her skin from a water barrel lashed to the starboard. Turning, she put a finger to her lips. Thrice she refilled the skin. Thrice she passed it among the desiccated skeletons. Thrice her heart leapt, believing she could hear her crewmates finishing their breakfast, making for the deck. And thrice she breathed a dizzying sigh of relief not to be caught in the act of mutiny. One of the women, a tall, muscled being with breasts the weight of coconuts and ritual scarring decorating her shoulders like poxy wings, could speak Arabic. Most of them could speak it to some degree. They knew the words for water, child, please, no, and hurt. But this one, shackled triply as testament to her strength, by the ankles, wrists, and from her neck to the former, could speak Arabic. Shahar squatted and grabbed the woman by the iron collar. She mashed her face into a venomous visage, but her words came gentle as the dawn. I need you to ready your women. The Ethiopian stared glassy-eyed at Shahar, disrobing her, de-bearding her in her mind. Her friends prodded soft fingers at her shoulders, asking in whispers for a translation. The woman batted them away, and slowly the pain of her past 10 days etched itself into the lines of her face. Shahar averted her gaze, ashamed of what she saw there. And why should we trust you, Simi Tseti, huh? Her accent was thick as Portuguese molasses, and deep, a timber moulded in the depths of time. You want to try trusting anyone else around here? Any of my crewmates? That soon quieted her. Look, I have a plan. You sound confident. Shahar smirked. Do you want help or not? Reluctantly, the Ethiopian nodded. She turned her head, observing the emaciated frames of her sisters, cousins, her mother, the oldest of the group, but ample arse enough for the pirates of the moonlit to have overlooked her age. Of course. The words through grinding teeth. Was that pride? Shahar lost control of her Yazidi cool for a moment, surprised by this resilience in the face of assistance. She was reminded of herself. Look, tonight we will reach Muscat. The captain will have us drop anchor in the bay so that we can make our grand entrance tomorrow by first light. Tonight, the crew will be celebrating safe passage below deck. That's when we make our move. It's our only chance. The woman's eyes flickered. Something Shahar couldn't catch. You really mean this, don't you? Shahar nodded, as gravely as she could. What's your name? She asked. Ife, replied the woman. Through the porthole at the end of her table, Shahar watched a new moon shed tentative light on the waves. Surely the most perfect of sights, she thought. It reminded her of the first time she'd seen the sea, 6 years old, hand in hand with her father, Chilem, on a trip to the beachfront at Aden. This water touches many far-off lands, Shahi. When you stand here, with your toes like this. She remembered the exhilaration of that sensation, a freshness which touched every microscopic inch of her. You stand feet to feet with someone else, 1,000,000 miles away. A stranger with whom you will always share that moment. Her father had been a philosophical man, a thinking man, a drunken and violent man. Her thoughts were shattered rudely by the clang of a metal bowl, dropped in front of her. Goat stew, 11th night running. Better yet, goat stew with the added crunch of occasional maggots. Delightful. Shahar pushed the contents around her dish with the back of her spoon. She had no stomach for eating. The organ was twisted up like a prince's turban, squirting the odd dollop of sickly acid into the cup of her throat. Tonight, her crewmates were rowdier than ever. As the ship rolled against the tide of the bay, the galley swam with fumbled sing-song and barked jokes of varying vulgarity. Slops of dinner flew through the air as missiles, sometimes landing wide of their mark, sometimes catching the quartermaster, cabin boy, a deckhand, or the boatswain square in the fizzog. Fights broke out from smaller scuffles, quickly ended by a sharp word from Captain Abd al-Yasu, who entertained the navigator and a handful of his favourite musicians at his own private table. Thusly, music filled the room. Creaking zithers, ouds, the tables as drums. One old salty devil struck up an improvised tune about the Imam and his promise.
Oh, raiders are we who sail the ocean, turning its waters red. Oh, raiders are we who capture beauties and ship them to his bed. The Imam wants his brew and his coffee, or else he'll strike us dead. But I've been sailing 50 years, and if there's one thing that I've said, is that before the Imam gets his beauties, I best be getting some head.
Shahar watched through the flailing limbs of raucous mirth, all snorts and spittle, as an amused grin formed on the captain's face. She thought of him then, the hand of help he'd extended her, whisking young Yazid from the danger of some god-forsaken port town. She thought of the betrayal she was planning, and her heart thundered in her chest.
Men!
Abd al-Yasu ibn Salman ibn Muhammad al-Surian stood up from his chair. With a single gesture, he brought the manic energies of the room to a lull.
Tomorrow morn we dock in Muscat. It has been a long and shitty voyage since last we were here, and I thank you for your service. Tomorrow we impart upon his bountiful eminence the prizes of our recent conquest. Look, I know, the bastard. But we made our mess, and tomorrow we clean it up, once and for all.
The men of the galley muttered accord among themselves.
But here, all listening, here I'm thinking, we can't touch the woman, of course.
What if they touch us?
Someone from the back hollered, to the delight of his friends.
Aye, very good, Ibrahim. But you had your chance. It's not my fault you're pussy shy.
Deftly, the captain had the crew back on his side, and distracted once more from their collective lust.
No touching tonight. We have to do right by the Imam if we would keep our heads. But here, wouldn't you boys like to see some dancing?
It took a moment for the question to register in the drunken brains of her crewmates, but once they'd got the captain's meaning, the room erupted like a geyser, full of lewd gestures and lewder remarks. Jingling his ring of keys from an outthrust finger, the captain addressed his frothing, crashing mass of horny apes.
Well then, who'll fetch them for me?
Shahar's heart was now solidly lodged in her throat. Saliva swilled the contours of her mouth, and she felt as if she might throw up. She had seen gore that could have curdled milk. Hell, she had dealt gore even more gruesome, and yet nothing had left her feeling so empty, so vacuous and ill as this. The room about her buckled and swelled, spilling its male contents like lumpy porridge over the tables toward the captain. Men clambered, climbed, kicked and wrestled their way toward the keys in the Syrian's hands, and the roar of protest became deafening. It was now or never. Shahar sat toward the rear of the galley, stood atop her solitary table, put her hands on her hips and yelled with all her might.
Captain!
The room hushed. Despite their fervour, everyone paused in their pursuit, and all eyes turned on Shahar. The captain, bemused, tilted his head, waiting.
Captain, let me do it. Abd al-Yasu chuckled, and the crew joined in. Captain, she continued, raising her voice to be heard, let me do it. Look, if you can look a single man in this room in the eye and tell me you trust him not to scratch your merchandise, well then fine. If not, then let me do it. I have no interest in these women. A look of confusion. Or was it suspicion? Shahar's heart was the prayer call of a muezzin from atop his minaret, loud, plosive, celestial. She watched the captain scan the room and balled her hand into a fist. At last, with a shuddering, silent sigh, Shahar exhaled the breath she'd been holding, as with a sudden grin, the captain turned to her and nodded. Well, a fair point, my friend. Watertight. Then, to the groans of the crowd, What? You think I don't know what you would do with them, all alone up there? Be quick about it, Yazid. And with that, he tossed Shahar his keys. With a grumble, the rest of the men got back to their drinking. Before long, their energies were jubilant again, forgetting the breasts they'd imagined groping, the sex they'd imagined stealing, turning their minds instead to the erotic hips they were surely about to see, turning and twisting below the navels of a dozen exotic women. As Shahar climbed the stairs out of the galley, only 2 pairs of eyes followed her. The apple greens of her captain, and the bruised purples of one Nasri al-Mansi. Moonlight fell dully on the moonlit Voyager's whaleboat, a dinghy of 10 oars with space enough for 12. That made them 1 person too many. Not bad, all things considered. Shahar worked fast to lower it to the water, navigating the pulley with one hand and pushing the thing away from the hull with an oar held in the other. The night was cool, but sweat beaded her forehead like a river, building against a dam. She had no free hand to wipe it clear, and periodically had to blink the salty wet from her eyes. She had been gone from the crew too long already, and still the women were fussing with their shackles. She'd given the one called Ife the captain's keys, indicating which corresponded to which locks, yet still she could see their task was incomplete. "What's the hold-up?" she hissed, wild-eyed, finding less than half of the slaves fully freed. My sisters are sick, tired. We are moving as fast as we can. Shit. Well, hurry.
The cacophony below deck was, up here, the muted rumblings of an earthquake, against a satin night, still and full of stars. Shahar prayed to them now, prayed to Muhammad and Yasu and all the prophets of Allah. Across the bay, the lights of Muscat twinkled. Shahar grit her teeth. Eventually, the chains fell. A dozen naked women from some nowhere village in the Ethiopian interior, stretching bruised and aching limbs, rubbing the life back into their extremities, aboard a vessel moored in the Gulf of Oman. The fear in their eyes told the rest. Shahar could not wait another second. With hushed and violent instruction, she shepherded the terrified flock to the starboard side and motioned for them to begin climbing. Ife acted as first mate, cooing encouragement among the saved, helping lift the weakest over the railing and holding their hands as far down as she could as they descended the net toward the whaleboat below. The rope, though, was old, the muscles gripping it exhausted and nervous. One woman missed her footing and fell the final 6 feet into the dinghy, a thud and splash of ocean cutting the night like a cannonball. Fucking hell, cursed Shahar. She could have sworn she heard the noise from the galley hush for a second. At long last, though, only she and Ife remained aboard the Moonlit. The Omani coast beckoned. Hit it, and they could skirt southeast, back to the fortress town of Al-Had, round the cape, and it was a straight coastal hug down to Yemen and the town of Aden, where all those years ago she had first tasted the salt of sea air. She had no idea how long that would take. She had not thought that far. As Ife and she lowered a water barrel and a barrel of moulding bread down into the whaleboat, she told her of her plan. The woman took Shahar by the hand. "I don't know who you are, Simi Seti, but..." She tried, but it seemed she could not find the words. Her eyes caught Shahar's, and in them was another world. "Thank you." Shahar nodded, blinking away a hot dampness springing at the corners of her eyes. "Go," she urged. "I'll follow." And Ife began to climb. But before Shahar could hoist a leg over the railings, she was stopped short, a hand on her shoulder, its grip like a blacksmith's tongs. "You fucking traitor! I knew it!" Nasri Almansi spun her round to face him. He wore a grin, maniacal in the moonlight, his eyes 2 marbles of polished zeal. "Fucking traitor!" Shahar went for her cutlass, but the man was already armed and swiped at her sword arm with his own. The blade whistled and stopped, a thick, meaty sound cushioning its trajectory. She looked down, found her wrist hanging by a thread, glistening ivory and saffron, vivid, elegant, excruciating. She stomached a scream. Adrenaline kicked in like a heartbeat skipped, and time slowed to a single falling droplet of shiny blood. She watched Nasri's face widen with some terrible glee as he observed the damage wrought. Watched him yank back the cutlass and whoop like a triumphant baboon. Watched him shake with the anticipation of his next attack. Before he could make a move, though, Shahar took her good hand and slammed it into his jaw. Teeth crashed together, and blood spurted from the section of Nasri's tongue caught between them. His elated cry morphed like a cat's meow into an agonized wail. "Fag!" he yelled. "Bitch!" he screamed. "Traitor!" Blood from his mouth spattered Shahar's cheeks like war paint. She hit him again, in the groin this time. Nasri buckled, but only for a second, and as she brought her elbow down upon the back of his head, she jerked suddenly to a stop. A long, low laugh moved from whispered to audible to thundering shriek, Nasri's eyes flashing with vengeance. Shahar's arms dropped limp, and her chin sagged to her chest. As her vision twisted whirlpool-like toward blackness, she saw in the timid moonlight 2 things. A blade, silver and silent, plunged up to the handle in her gut, turning slowly scarlet as her lifeblood ebbed from her. And below, already detaching itself from the moonlit, already beginning its passage to the shores of Oman and to freedom, she saw a boatful of women, silently grieving, mourning lost time, lost innocence, lamenting the alienness of their surrounds and a home too far gone to return to. And there was Ife, sending a message on the night breeze, like Muhammad, raised to heaven on the winds of the world and the wings of a steed, pausing for a beat by the ears of Shahar to whisper, "Thank you, stranger." As darkness came, Shahar listened to the ocean and thought of home. Thank you for listening to Stories from the Hearth. If you liked what you heard, please do subscribe, follow, and share this podcast with friends, family, and anyone you know who could use just a half hour's respite from the chaotic energies of the everyday. If you wish to support the podcast, please head to my Patreon by hitting the link in the description. Similarly, you can check out the podcast's Instagram, Twitter, and website via the links below, or send me an email on storiesfromthehearthpodcast@gmail.com. I will be releasing a new episode every 3 weeks, and with your help, in time I hope to upload them even more regularly. I've been Callum Bannerman, and you've been listening to Stories from the Hearth.